Right, this week we're going to be discussing two passages in Sefer Shmuel that at first glance don't seem to make any sense. They contradict each other. We'll see some of the classic Rishonim, how they try to, on a pshat level, understand the two sections in Shmuel. Then we'll see how our Gemara, and a more Agadic take, tries to understand it, and perhaps what's motivating it. And then, if there's time at the end, we'll learn this Achron named the Gaon Yaakov, who has a crazy interpretation of the whole situation that we'll be discussing. So let's get started by looking at the stories in Shmuel. So what we're going to be discussing, what our Gemara is talking about in Yevamot is around the whole story of how David HaMelech's lineage is through Ruth, who's a Moaviyah, and also his son Shlomo, right, marries Naamah Ammonit, and then they have Rechavam, who becomes the next king. So, you have a Moabite woman who is the great-grandmother of David, and then you have an Ammonite woman who is the mother of Rechavam. And so, how do we understand the prohibition of Lo Yavo Ammoni Moavi B'Kal Hashem? That, Ammon and Moab are not allowed to marry into the Jewish people, and so the Mishnah Yevamot says Ammoni v'lo Ammonit, Moavi v'lo Moaviyah. Right? It's only the males that are prohibited, not the females. And then there's a fascinating Gemara about how that was decided and understood, and the relationship between Torah Shebechtav and Torah Sheba'al Peh on that whole topic. But that's not what we'll be dealing with for now. But that is the springboard for our discussion, which is around David's lineage and his ancestry. So if we look at these two stories in Shmuel Aleph, Perek Tet Zayin and Yud Zayin, it's right after Shaul is rejected and David is anointed. So right after David is anointed by Shmuel, we're told in Shmuel Aleph, Perek Tet Zayin, we'll read the psukim quickly. V'ruach Hashem saral me'im Shaul uvi'atatu ruach ra'a me'et Hashem. So Shaul is plagued by, what maybe an evil spirit from God. He has these episodes where he is tortured and tormented. Vayamru avdei Shaul elav hinei na ruach Elokim ra'a mebaitecha yomar na Adonenu avadecha levanecha yvakshu ish yodea menagen bakinor vaya biyot alech ruach Elokim ra'a v'nigen bido v'tov lach. So his Shaul's servants suggest, let's bring a musician who can come and soothe you when you have these episodes, and he can calm you down. So Shaul agrees. So we don't know who this servant was, but he waxes on about David's qualities. He says, a son of Yishai, Beit Alachmi, that's going to become relevant. So there's a son of Yishai from Beit Lechem who, he has all these admirable character traits. So Shaul sent servants to Yishai. David bincha asher batzon. Send me David, the shepherd, your son. So Yishai sends David to Shaul. So Shaul really, he takes a liking to David and makes him an arms bearer. So Shaul sends again to Yishai and says, may David not just come and provide this musician services, but may he be, part of the palace, part of the household of the palace, because he has found favor in my eyes. And David would play the music for Shaul whenever he was tormented by this evil spirit, and he would calm him down. Okay, so this story happens right after David is anointed, and he's brought to the palace. Shaul really takes a liking to him and asks for him to stay on as a permanent member of the palace staff. The very next parak is the story of David and Goliath. After David kills Goliath and wins the battle, we're told as follows: V'chiot Shaul et David yatzeh likrat haplishti, amar elav ner sar hatzava, ben mi ze anar Avner. Okay, so Shaul sees David coming back from battle with Goliath, and he turns to Avner, who's his chief general in the army, and says, whose son is that boy? Right? Vayomer Avner chai nafshecha hamelech im yadati. And Avner says, I have no idea. ויאמר המלך שאל אתה בן מי זה העלם. So the king says to Avner, okay, so go ask him whose son he is. וחשוב דוד מהכות את הפלישתי ויקח אותו אבנר ויביא לפני שאול וראש הפלישתי בידו. So David is brought to Shaul with Goliath's head in his hand. ויאמר אליו שאול בן מי אתה הנער? And Shaul asks him himself explicitly, whose son are you? ויאמר דוד בן עבדך ישי בית הלחמי. Right? I am the son of your servant Yishai who's from Beit Lechem. So what is the obvious difficulty in these two passages in a sentence?
Didn't Shaul know who David was?
Yeah, right? Doesn't he know who he is? Why is he asking Avner who he is, asking Avner to ask him who he is, then asking him himself who he is? We're told in explicit detail in the previous parak that he sends a messenger to Yishai's house to bring David. He loves David. He sends a messenger to Yishai again, asking for David to be at his palace. So why now, after David then goes and fights Goliath, does Shaul seem to not know who he is or who his father is? So it's an obvious problem, right? You want to say something, Abba?
Does anyone propose en gudamu mu'achar? I mean, because that's one possible solution here, that these are out of sequence.
I didn't see that, but I guess that's one way to resolve this.
Yes, I mean it's kind of a fudge, but whatever.
Yeah, I mean then you can ask the question on Perek Tet Zayin, right? That. Right, in that case, Shaul would know who he is already in that context, because he already knew him from Goliath. You're right. I guess it's less problematic than the order that it's given, but it's still not great.
It's not great.
Right. So how do we understand this? Right. So first let's look at some of the classic Mefarshim. So the Ralbag says as follows: Rabim itmahu ech yitachen shelo yada Shaul ben mihu. So he's commenting on the story after Goliath. He says many were troubled by this. Right? Why doesn't Shaul know who he is? Because we're already told that Shaul sent messengers to Yishai requesting that David live with him in the palace. And the Rabbak says as follows: V'yidmeh ki hamelech l'rov esakav l'rov haba'im lefanav lo yuchal le'akir kol echad mehem bifrat. Right? That kings are busy. Kings have lots of things going on. Right? So Shaul, even if he took a liking to David, he's still a servant, right? He's still just one of who knows how many people who fill how many different roles and the king in the king's life and in his scope. So he was told this one time who that servant was. He took a liking to him, so he sent again. But it's not as though he said, go send the messenger to Yishai necessarily. He said, make sure this kid stays on with me. He doesn't remember the kid's lineage because he has tons of people who are part of his extended, part of the royal palace. So that's what the Ralbag argues, that once that he knew David was special, but he didn't necessarily remember who he was, because there's lots of people whose names and lineages he had to remember in his role as king. But then when David kills Goliath, that's a whole other level. Right? Then we're talking about something else entirely, and so Shaul says, okay, maybe Shaul even recognized David at that point, or maybe he didn't, he just knows he's one of the servants, but he says, find out who this guy really is, right? והתבאר מתשובת דוד לו, ששאלת שאול לא הייתה רק לדעת מיהו, כדי שיתבאר לו מה זו משפחה הוא, כי כבר הבטיחו שייתן לו ביתו לאישה. I don't want to get into that now, but there's a story with that Michal was promised to David as well, but that actually happens in the next parak. The answer for the Ralbag is essentially that just think about Shaul's responsibilities and what he had to do as king, and even though we're told that he took a liking to David, it doesn't necessarily mean that he invested too much in knowing who he was. But once the story with Goliath happens, then he needs to find out who this person really is.
I mean, he could also have thrown in there the fact that we know that Shaul is mentally unstable, so maybe it has more than one, this manifestation as well.
Right. He doesn't say that though. Right? He doesn't say.
No, I'm saying he could have said that.
He could have said that. That's another possible explanation. That, again, depending how we understand what Ruach Ha'am et Hashem means, that it could be that in his moments of clarity he doesn't necessarily remember or understand, and so he could have forgotten. But the Ralbag does not suggest that.
I have to go back and read the actual sequence from the beginning and the whatever. But is it possible that Shaul is up on, let's say, the hilltop overseeing this scene, with Goliath, and then this soldier from his forces is going to confront him, but he's far away. He doesn't recognize him from that distance, and so he's sending his whatever, his general to go and say, go find out who is that heroic kid there who just confronted Goliath. I can't see him from up here.
That's interesting. Yeah. The only thing I would say that maybe makes that a difficult explanation is that would make sense for when he says to Avner, go find out who he is. But then Avner brings David before Shaul with Goliath's head in his hand. And then Shaul asks him, who are you? Right? At that point, he's close enough that he should know who he is. But it's an interesting approach. In other words, I hadn't thought of that at all. Maybe
he can't believe his eyes. This is this kid who plays the harp for me, and whatever. And now he's maybe bloody and sweating, and and maybe he still had a helmet on his head, or he threw it off when he fight God, whatever. But he doesn't even recognize him. He can't even imagine it's the same person.
Yeah, I think that might be in line with what the Gemara will end up saying in a different way. What you're suggesting now. But yeah, it's a good suggestion. It's not what the Ralbag says, but it makes sense. Let's see I'll just look at one more pshat interpretation of the Abarbanel. So he says as follows, right? Shal Shaul Avner kasher ra'at David yotze likrat ha'plishti ben mi ze anar. So Shaul asks Avner, who is this? V'lo yashoel ze lehit nakro bo v'lo ladat ma shemo v'shem aviv. He doesn't ask this to know, to actually, in other words, he's not asking whose son is that because he doesn't know whose son it is. Right? He's not really asking to know who David or his father are. And he says, whose son is that? He's not saying literally, is he the son of Yishai? He's saying, who is this guy in the sense of, what's his story? Who's his father? Was his father this great warrior that now his son is coming and defeating Goliath? Right, this kid goes out with no fear, with this great courage and this conviction. Right, it's a turn of phrase almost, not literally who's his father, but where does he get this strength from? Hu ben ish gibor rav pa'olim שיתדמה אליו בנו באומץ לבבו וגבורותיו. אבל כפי הפשט שעל תכונת אביו ומידותיו ולא על משפחתו. Right? And Abrabanel says, but the pshat, the way he understands it, is that you shouldn't understand Shaul's question literally of who is his father, but rather, what are the characteristics of his father? Put it that way. Why is this guy such a gibor chayil type thing? So that's the Abarbanel's interpretation.
Ron.
Yeah.
It reminds me of when Yaakov is blessing, when Yaakov is blessing the Yosef, and he asks, who are these, when he blesses Ephraim and Menashe, he's like, Miza, he's like, who is this? It's the same idea, and that Rashi explains that who are these people coming out of Shem and Menashe? So maybe here's the same idea, I want to know more of his lineage, I want to know more of where he comes from, something like that. I don't know. Mm-hmm. It's a similar terminology. Who is that? When it's kind of clear to see that you know who it is.
Right. I agree with your analogy. Right. Especially, I think that makes sense given the context here. Right. He's not saying because he knows who David is. David is a really good musician who calms him down. So he's not saying, who is he? He's saying, who is he? Who is this guy? Right? Now he's this warrior. What is his deal? What is his story? That's really what he's asking. So then we have to kind of understand David's response. Right? David says, I'm the son of your servant Yishai. In other words, he's not saying anything about his courage or conviction. He's giving an answer to the literal question of what his lineage is. So why is that? But I think Ephraim, your point is well taken. Also, Yaakov, you would assume that he knew who his grandchildren were. There's midrashim that say perhaps not, but that's for another time. Great. Let's look at a quick Gemara in Brachot, and then we'll look at our Gemara in Yevamot. So the Gemara in Brachot says as follows: Veish b'mei Shaul zaken ba ba'anashim. So this is in the story of Goliath, a reference to Yishai. It describes Yishai as being old already, right? In the time of the battle with Goliath. So Amar Rava v'yitem Rav Zvid v'yitem Rav Yoshaya ze Yishai avi David she'atza be'uchlusa. So Baba Nashim, the way they interpret that, it means that he would go out with a crowd, v'nichnas be'uchlusa, and he would come in with a crowd, v'darash be'uchlusa, and he would teach Torah in a crowd. What does that mean? Amar Ula nikitinan ein uchlusia beBavel. So we have a teaching that there isn't a crowd in the whole of Bavel. In other words, crowd is such a large amount of people that's being referred to here that in Bavel it doesn't exist. Vetana, and it was taught, Ein uchlusa pchuta mishishim ribo. Right, uchlusa is not less than 600,000, the number of Jews that were counted that left Egypt. In other words, what's being described here is that Yishai, when we say he was zaken baba nashim, that he was old and he was a big deal. Like he was the type of guy that 600,000 people would follow him everywhere, and he would teach Torah to like the equivalent of the entire nation. He was a very, very important guy, right? So that's kind of the take of the Gemara and Brachot, that Yishai himself, it's not just David who ends up becoming obviously a big deal, but his father Yishai also had all of this yichus, as it were. So now let's actually look at our Gemara with all of that background in mind. So as we said, the Mishnah in Yevamot teaches Amoni u'Moavi asurim b'Yisuran Yisur Olam. So male Ammon and Moab cannot marry in ever. Avan kavotehen mutarot miyad. But the female ones are permitted immediately. Gemara, menani mile. How do we know this? Why would you assume that? Amar of Yochanan de Amar Kra. The pasuk says, "V'chirot Shaul David yotze likrat haplishti, Amar el Avner sar tzava ben mi ze hanar Avner v'yomer Avner chana shcha hamelech im yadati." Right, which we know. Shaul asks Avner, "Who is this guy?" And the Gemara says, "V'lo yadale." Does he not know who he is? V'aktiv. It says in the previous parak, "Vayevehu me'od, v'hilo nosek kelim." Right, he loved him very much, made him someone much more important than what he had been before. Obviously, he knew who he was. So he's not asking about David. He knows who David is. He's asking about his father. Right? When he says Ben mi ze anar, he's asking who's David's father. The Gemara says, "What do you mean? Vaviv lo yadale?" But same question. He didn't know his father. V'aktiv v'ish b'mei she'ol zaken baba nashim. V'amar avi tema Rabbi Abba ze Yishai avi David shenichnas b'uchlusa v'yatza b'uchlusa, which is what we saw in Brachot. That basically, if Yishai, the Gemara assumes, went out with this whole crowd, and in the days of Shaul, he was this big deal. So how could Shaul not have known who Yishai was? So how can you say that Ben Mizeh Anar is referring to him asking who David is or who Yishai is? So Achika Amar Shaul. No, this is what Shaul's really asking, and this is, I think, the genius of this midrash, right? He's asking Imi Peretz Ati, Imi Zerach Ati. So he says Ben Mizeh Anar. He's not asking who his father is. He's asking who his father's father's father is. Is he a descendant of Peretz or Zerach, the twin children of Yehuda? Right? Why does he care? Imi Peretz Ati Malka Have. Because if he comes from Peretz, then he's a king. Right? שהמלך פורץ לעשות דרך. Because we know that kings, they breach and they burst forth to make a path. And David just killed Goliath. He's got the personality of a Pורץ. So if he comes from Peretz, then he's potentially a king. Memachín Bido, and nobody can stop him. But if he comes from Zerach, ati chashiva be'alma. He can be an important individual, but he's not going to be a king. So what's going on here? Right? What is the Gemara really saying? So we'll look at the Mefarshim and Gemara in a second, but I think just one way to understand this is the Gemara has a very sharp insight into the dynamics that are going on, right? That Shaul was just, in a sense, dethroned. He's still the king, but Shmuel had just told him that you are not going to continue to rule. And this evil spirit enters Shaul. And we see in the following prakim that Shaul becomes paranoid and eventually starts to chase David. And he pursues him and he tries to kill him. So right, obviously what's on Shaul's mind is that he sees David defeat Goliath, and he's starting to kind of build this story in his head of this guy could be a potential threat. In other words, I brought him into the palace, but now he's this great warrior, and even though only in the following prakim he builds a following and he starts to actually become a threat to Shaul, at this point, not yet, but by saying that it's imi paretz ati mizerach ati, that Shaul is, what he's really asking is, like, who is this guy, but in the sense of, is he someone who I need to be worried about, right? Is he someone who is the descendant of Peretz? He's royalty, right? in the full sense of the term. And that's what's motivating Shaul's question here, because he's got this ruach ra'ah, and he's afraid of being usurped by somebody else. And as we see, that actually comes to fruition, later on in Sefer Shmuel.
It's a weird association just popped into my head from the Megillah, where what's his name, Haman, is already, his decline has begun, and his cronies are saying, oh boy, you're screwed. It's sort of, I don't know, I was reminded of that now for some reason.
Interesting, yeah. That makes sense, right? If he's from Peretz, then that's it. Ein memachin bido. Then there's nothing I can do. He's kind of on his way up, and that's it, right? And that's what he's trying to ascertain. Yeah. Good. Okay, so then that's what our Gemara suggests, right? Obviously, it's not the pshat. But because of the difficulties in the pshat that we saw the Ralbag kind of try to figure out, he's busy, he doesn't really know who all his servants are, the Barbanel, right? Abi made some suggestions, but they all kind of have their issues. So the Gemara sees here an opportunity to come up with, I think, a midrashic interpretation of this, but actually in an ironic way, which perhaps is possibly even the most pshat explanation within the larger context of what happens in the continuation of Sefer Shmuel. It gives kind of that explanation for why Shaul suddenly becomes so paranoid about David. I want to look at two commentaries. If we have time, we'll do the second one. If not, we can skip it. But the first one is the Rif, which is the Achron commentary in the Ein Yaakov on our Gemara. And the Rif suggests as follows. I don't want to read the whole thing. Let me just... Yeah, okay, great. So it says, we'll skip the question, right? He just kind of reformulates the question we've asked 1,000 times. And he says as follows, V'efshar li'ashev, and it's possible to explain the whole question here. The bitchila k'sheshal Shaul Avner ben mi zeh ha'elem, or ha'alem, when Shaul first asks, who is this? Right, even though he knew who it was, which is similar to what the Abarbanel had said, right? He's asking where he had the gall to go out and challenge Goliath. That's really what he's asking. Amar le'Avner ben mi hu zeh, kolomar ve'alo ben Yishaihu ve'en le'aviv gvurat lev lamilchama, kedei litmaded beno b'gvurat lev zu. Right, that Yishai isn't this great warrior. Again, here he's assuming not like our Gemara necessarily assumes, but saying Yishai is this old man. So where does David get this kind of courage from? וכיוון שהיה יודע באביו ישי שהיה גיבור חייל במלחמה, אין להתפלא אם מאז יצא גיבור. ומה שחזר שאול לומר לדוד בשובו מהכות את הפלישתי בן מי זה אתה הנער. So what he's doing here is he's reading into the back and forth the flow of the Gemara. Right? That what happened in the Psukim is first Shaul asks Avner, who is this guy? Then David comes and Shaul asks him directly, who are you? So why does he ask Avner to find out, and then he asks David himself? So the Gemara says that first he asks Avner, who is he? And then he finds out that his father is Yishai, and then he knows Yishai is this Gibor. So he kind of, the first one is the Abarbanel, but then in the second one, the second question where he asks David directly, so he knows that it's not Yishai, so he has a different question. It's not the same question the first time and the second time. What is it the second time? Yesh lomar sheratza livdok bo im gavar rucho b'harigat haplishti וביחנו בשאלתו בין מי זה אתה הנער, כאילו נעלם ממנו, מי היה אביו. So this is actually, I think, an interesting interpretation, that what Shaul is doing is he's pretending not to know who David's lineage is. In other words, the first time he asks Avner who is he doesn't know who his father is, or he doesn't know who Yishai is. Then he's told who Yishai is. But then when Shaul asks David directly, whose son are you? He's pretending not to know. He already found out from Avner, right? He asks Avner, all right, tell me who this guy is. This actually, Abba, makes a lot of sense with what you suggested, that Shaul's up on the mountaintop, and then he sees him from far away but doesn't know who he is. He asks Avner, go find out who that guy is. Then Avner tells him who he is, and he knows who David and Yishai are. So then when he brings David to him, when he asks David, who are you? He's not actually trying to find out, because he already found out from Avner. He's testing David. He already got the information, but he's asking him, whose son are you? In order to see im gavar rucho b'harigata plishti. Right? To see how David responds. When the king asks you, who are you, after you did a courageous act, how you respond is going to tell a lot about your character. Right? So, Ki'ilu ne'elam mimenu. It says Shaul is as though forgot who David's lineage is. V'im hashav yeshivenu ben rosh hatzava Yishai ani, hu yoreh geuto v'geono v'ramut rucha de'it be. Because if David said something to the effect of, oh, I'm the son of Yishai, who was this great, great general of yours, or something to that effect, then Shaul would know that he is full of himself, or full on his victory, or that he has that arrogance, right? V'David be'anvuto hishivo ben avdachai Yishai, right? But what David responded is simply, I am the son of your servant Yishai beit halachmi, right? That, not the son of this great general, not that I'm this great deal because I just killed Goliath, but he answered very humbly and simply. And so I think the Rif has a different spin on this, but one that maybe makes sense. And again, I think Abba, with your pshat, it actually ties in nicely. That he's setting up a situation here. Shaul is actually being strategic. He sees this person off in the distance defeat Goliath, and he is trying to understand how to play this. So he wants to size up this guy, right? He doesn't. So first he asks Avner, find out who he is. Then Avner finds out who he is, says, oh, okay, I know who he is, right? Yishai, his father, was this great general. But then when he brings David before him, he's testing him. And he says, who are you, to see how David answers, to see how if he should relate to him as a threat, or as someone who is full of himself, or thinks that something is magia to him, or whatever it is. And David answers humbly and says, no, I'm just, ben avdecha Yishai beit halachmi. So I think that's also like a plausible way to understand the story in Shmuel Perek Zayin.
Of course, the irony here is that David was perhaps the most calculating character in the entire Tanakh.
Right. So then the question is, when David answers Ben Avdachai Yishai Beit Halachmi, so the Rif says he said that out of his humility. But perhaps you can also say that David is trying to be calculating on his side as well, and he realizes if he starts waxing on about his father's accomplishments or about his own greatness in battle, that might not be the wisest thing to do in the situation. And the king's asking you to kind of tell yourself about him. So yeah, there's a lot going on here, but I think the Rif is picking up on those dynamics, which the Ralbag and the Abarbanel and even our Gemara didn't necessarily highlight to that extent. A couple more minutes. It's a very long thing with the Gaon Yaakov. He has a whole interpretation, but I'll say it outside. Maybe we won't have time to read it inside. And he says a few things that are pretty, I think, controversial or interesting. But his basic thesis is as follows. He says he's less interested in answering the exact question that we've been talking about, and more trying to understand the question that the Gemara puts in the mouth of Shaul, which is he from Peretz or is he from Zerach? Right? Like, which of Yehuda's sons is David a descendant of? And the Gaon Yaakov asks the question and says, who cares, right? The Chi Shema Garim, right? We have this idea, like, does a person's name determine is that like decisive of their fate? In other words, if he came from Peretz, that means he can be king, and if he came from Zerach, that means he can't be king because of the Poroetz and it's a nice drasha, fine, but does that mean that he's going to be king or not? What's going on there? So basically what the Gaon Yaakov develops is this whole idea where he says as follows. He says that everything about, I wish we could read inside, but I don't want to keep you guys, everything about the lineage of the whole heritage of the Malchut David is like every aspect of it has to be this borderline illegitimate lineage. Nothing about it can be just a normal stock, right? Nothing about it is pure blood. It's all strange, right? Right, from the mother's side, obviously, Ruth Moaviyah, she's obviously, and we didn't learn that Gemara inside, but behind that Mishnah of the women are allowed, there's a whole controversy in the days of Shmuel about whether that's true or not, and they end up saying yes. But the fact that his great-grandmother's a Moabite is controversial. And then obviously on the father's side, you go all the way back to the story of Yehuda and Tamar. So it's a controversial story, right? Because Tamar was the wife of Yehuda's sons, and then it was done biznut, and the whole idea is that it's very not appropriate. And even of course Ammon and Moab, in other words, Ruth Moaviyah. So you go back to how Moab was born; it was also Lot and his daughters. So everything about the family is flawed. The language that the Gaon Yaakov uses is kupa shel shratzim. All right, that it's a box of everything about it is this box of insects, whatever. And so, given that, he builds the following argument. He says that he quotes the Ramban, who says that actually before Matan Torah, the laws of Yibum were for the father and not for the brother. Right, without going into how the Ramban knew that or his sources, that we know Yibum is if a brother dies and the brother has to marry the wife. But before Matan Torah, it was actually the father, which means that really Yehuda was the one who was supposed to marry Tamar. But he goes into all this whole thing that when it comes to Yibum, there's a difference between Bia Rishona and Bia Shnia. There's a lot of halacha there, but Bia Rishona is the first act, and then Bia Shnia symbolizes anything after that. He says Bia Rishona is the key part of the mitzvah, because you do it the first time, and then it's purely in order to fulfill the mitzvah of Yibum, in order to try to have children and to keep the brother's name on. But anything that comes after that, Bia Shnia and onwards, perhaps could be tainted with a little bit of, not for the sake of the mitzvah, but just purely for the pleasure of it. So he says, actually, when it comes to the lineage of David, I jumped a step. And then he says one more thing. He says something really, really strange, where he says, let me find it inside, because this is worth seeing. And then this is the last piece of his argument, and then we'll get to kind of here. The kvar hiskimu hativiyim deleidat teomim hu vadai mishtei biot. Right, so the naturalists all agree that twins come from two consecutive acts of relations, right? So, okay, but so what that would mean then is that when you have the birth of twins, it means that there were kind of two acts together, and then it led to the birth of twins. So he says as follows: Yehuda and Tamar, the fact that they had twins, which is Peretz and Zerach, means that they had two acts, but it was done through the dinim of Yibum. And with the Yibum of Bia Rishona is done in purity for the sake of the mitzvah, but Bia Shnia is perhaps a little bit more tainted because it's done simply for the pleasure of it. So he says that's what Shaul is trying to understand when he says Imi Peretz, Imi Zerach. Why? Because if you remember, when Peretz and Zerach were born, like one of them sticks the hand out and pulls it back in, and then the other one comes out, right? The order is all mixed up with the thread and everything. So he says that here. He says, Lekach Peretz de Yatzar Rishon, right? So Peretz ended up was the firstborn, but he started out first and then came back in. He started out last, but then he went back in and he came out first. So he was from the Bia Shnia, right? Because the Teomim had to be from two. So Peretz was from the second one. And the second one, V'yesh bo dofi, right? It has some flaw in it because it's the Bia Shnia. And because it has that flaw of it not being Bia Rishona and Yibum, but rather tainted with the Isur of Eshet Ach and doing it just for pleasure, so therefore he's Ru'ei LaMelucha, because all the lineages of David are the Kupashot Shatzim, and there has to be something wrong with them. Aval Zerach, but Zerach was the first son, She'etza Acharon, he came out last, Al Kor Chayam Bia Rishona. He was from the first act, Shenizra b'kedusha, which was done in holiness, Rabba b'mitzvat yibum, b'yerishona ein bo shum dofi. It has no taint of kupa shel shratzim, klal, ve'ech yihya r'ui melucha. And so therefore, it can't be r'ui for the kingship. So, it's just this really elaborate theory with a lot of interesting assumptions that I thought was just kind of interesting to note. Yeah.
So there's one other motif here we didn't touch on directly. I don't really know what to make of it, but if you look in Breshit, obviously there's this notion of the subversion of primogeniture is, just pervasive in Sefer Breshit, right? Anybody who's a Bechor should have, the firstborn rights and whatever, obviously ends up, not getting that. That continues in Tanakh, and then David is absolutely the exemplar of the subversion of primogeniture. He's the seventh son, and his lineage is fakakt legamre. Look at all of the different things. So you can come up with any number of theories, but there's somewhere or other I'm seeing a theme here that somehow the individual's worth has to be judged by, despite the laws of Bechorah and the Torah and everything, that the individual's worth has to be judged by something other than his lineage, his place of birth, his ancestry, that there's some inherent value to the individual that's not deterministic. And somehow or other, David seems to be the exemplar of that.
I agree. I would say that it's that tension, that it's both, paradoxically, that David is the direct descendant of Yehuda, who is the Shevet of Malchut. In other words, if David hadn't been a descendant of Yehuda, he couldn't have been.
Yehuda was no more of a Bechorah than David.
Right. I guess you're saying retroactively. You can apply all these things to Yehuda being Lo Yasur Shevet mi Yehuda and all that stuff that he was. Right. Yeah. No, definitely. I mean, that's what's underpinning a lot of this. And that's kind of a whole fascinating topic in and of itself. Like, why is it so like you said, so fakakt, like his lineage? There's significance to that for sure, right? It's
obviously important, even beyond the Torah and the Tanakh in general, to somehow keep hammering on that theme. There have been a lot of ink spilled, I imagine, on like what is the underlying meaning of that. But at least the way I've read it is that it's an internal argument in Tanakh against this determinism of things like Bechorah or lineage or things like that. At the end of the day, the individual is going to make his or her own way in the world based on their own character and their own qualities.
Yeah, I think so. Sure. Definitely. Mm-hmm. I mean, it continues on, right? Shlomo is the child of Bathsheba, and that whole
so
thing.
Forth and so
forth. And then Rechavam, as we said, is the son of Naamah, who's an Ammonite, and it goes on and on.
etc.
Yeah. Sure.
I think that's nice, in terms of the lineage not being relevant, and it should be based on each individual. How far you can go should be based on each individual's effort. It's a great concept, and potentially is being lost a little bit in certain of our communities where yichus, plays a big part. In the more shidduch orientated Haredi communities.
Yeah, you had to go there, Johnny.
Yeah, well, what I'm trying to say. where Dafka, there's people can't find a shidduch because their father is this or their mother is that, Whereas, really, this is saying Dafka, it's all the people who have, a, dodgy lineage that get, that went places.
Yeah, I think it's, in my head, I agree 100%. I think it's more that both of these principles somehow coexist together in an obvious tension. Like the fact that lineage is a huge deal and that it's not a determining thing at all. Because you have, first of all these halachot in the Torah about how somehow the firstborn still makes a big deal and all that stuff. And then that, in general, you have again, back to the Torah and all the laws there, that it's about who your father is, and that everything was counted based on what tribe. Everything is about what tribe you're. So it does matter, but yeah, on an individual level, perhaps an individual can still kind of overcome all of that. That whole subversive narrative obviously continues into Rabbinic Judaism too, right? That you have the famous Mishnah in Horiot that says Mamzer Talmud Chacham Yoter Gadol Mi Kohen Gadol Ha'aretz. The idea that and then that's kind of maybe polemic against the fact that it's all about the lineage, and there's a tension there between the idea of kind of you being born into greatness, and you not just that it doesn't matter that you're born into greatness, but dafka the greatest are the ones who are like born into the worst of like the opposite of the greatness, are the ones who become great. There's something there that is informing a lot of the stories here.
What's so striking to me, and again, maybe someone else can call to mind something else, but I cannot readily call to mind another motif in the Tanakh that so insistently is like this. These two principles that are at such loggerheads throughout Tanakh, not just the Torah, and it's always been a puzzlement. Like, what is it trying to teach us? I came up with one hypothesis, but I can't think of any other example that's quite that striking and so pervasive in the entire Tanakh.
Yeah. Yeah, I think these midrashim are dealing with all of that in kind of their own poetic way. That tension. Just the fact that this.
Even Moshe Rabbeinu wasn't a before.
Right. Yeah. I mean, David is the youngest. He's the littlest one, etc. He's like not even thought of. Right. What's the language that like Shmuel doesn't even think of David, and God says, like, man looks. What is the pasuk? It says man. Hashem says man looks at the body, but God looks at the heart. Something like that. Which is perhaps underpinning all of this. Like, if you could summarize this, everything that we just discussed in a sentence, it would be. Right? ויאמר השם לשמואל אל תביט אל מראהו ואל גובה קומתו כי מאסתיהו כי לא אשר יראה האדם כי האדם יראה לעיניים והשם יראה ללבב. Right? That's what matters, right? Like that's the story of David in a nutshell. It doesn't matter the things that other people care about or that they make judgments about, like Johnny said about yichus and stuff like that. God looks at the heart, and his anointed one is.
It's the story of Yaakov. It's the story of
Right. God's anointed one is the one who merits it. Which I think, and I'm going to stop. Okay, we're way over time, but I think that's actually a flaw in democracy. Right? Everyone, all of us with our Western sensibilities, we are obsessed with democracy as the ultimate form of government. But in today's system, anyone who becomes president or prime minister of democracy in today's world has to really, 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 really want it. No matter what, they have to do whatever it takes, because you need to be so obsessed with the fact that you need to be the president or prime minister. In order to get to that point, you need to build up all the lobbying and do all the press releases and denigrate your opponents. The whole system is set up for only the people who are so obsessed with, and I think if I'm also kind of going to say a polemic of Tanakh is anti that all the great leaders are the ones who say, leave me alone, right? Like Shaul is like that, David is like that, Moshe of course is like that. Like the ones who...
I don't think you can say that of David. I think he was calculating from the cradle already, how he's going to be king. If you read his biography, he's the most calculating, by far the most calculating figure maybe in all of ancient literature, certainly in our literature, and he made it happen.
Right. Well, if you take this story at face value, the one we just read, he was anointed, and what that means is God sees in the sense that it wasn't maybe he was calculating, so maybe he's not as strong of an example, but it's still the underdogs are the ones that you would never, who start, right? Like, I don't know, like. For sure, Moshe is the obvious example. Like Yirmiyahu rejects the prophecy, Shaul rejects the prophecy, Yonah. Most of the great leaders are the ones who don't want it, and that's, of course, ironically, what makes them good leaders is that not interested in their own grandeur or their own power. Anyways, we're way over time.